can you figure out your selling proposition and your value hooks that you're going to focus on? What is it that you're really testing in the first place in terms of the message to the market?
Danny, I'm super excited to have you join me for this episode of Coffee with Closers.
Thanks, Sam. Great to be here.
Can you share with our audience a little bit about your journey of becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you say it that way, gosh, it makes me realize I'm a whole lot less young than I thought I was.
That was not my intention.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I mean, for me, my entrepreneurial journey really started as a kid. So my father had a small business that he owned and ran, and I would help sometimes on breaks from school or weekends in his warehouse, and just got to see a little bit of what it's like to run a business. And I was always fascinated by entrepreneurship. So in my mind, that was always the path I wanted to head down from a very young age. I took my first foray down that direction when I was in college. I started a company in the e-commerce space. And to set the scene at the time, this was sort of during the rise of eBay. So e-commerce was not what it is today, nowhere near as established or the same tools. But I saw an opportunity, and frankly, in hindsight, that business probably could have been a lot bigger than it ended up being. But one of the greatest things I got from that experience, apart from just it was fun, was the humility to realize how much I didn't know at the age of 19, 20, 21, trying to build a business. And so that was what led me ultimately down the path of working for some of those larger tech companies, was just saying, okay, I've got to go learn from other folks who know more than I do. I want to learn as much about this industry as possible. I thought it would be 2-3 years and then start my next company, and it turned into more like a decade. So, sometimes you get into something and you end up having a lot more fun with it and finding it to be a lot more interesting than you expected. And I think it's good to let life take you in those directions that it naturally takes you, because we might have an idea of where we want to go, but sometimes that idea should be updated. But anyhow, it was 10 years working in larger company environments, learning a lot, getting to know the industry, getting to play entrepreneur in a larger company atmosphere with more resources and more opportunity to fail, frankly, before I finally felt comfortable enough to go back and try again. And so it was at that point, about 12 years ago, that I met my co-founder, Alex. We met at a startup event. It was, I think the first one we did might have been a startup weekend or a lean startup machine. But one of those events where you come together and you kind of go through the early phases of validating a concept over the course of a weekend. Now, we had a lot of fun, said, hey, let's do this again in a few months. We did. We hit on something, and that was what ultimately led down the path of what would become Tailwind some years later.
I saw that you're still an advisor and mentor at a couple of those startup incubator kind of businesses as well.
Yeah, I mean, those are really less my businesses or my projects and more community-oriented organizations that now that I've been down the entrepreneurial path for a while and I've had time in the larger tech companies like Google and YouTube and AOL, frankly, I just like to give back to others and help other entrepreneurs who are earlier on in their career. And here in Oklahoma specifically, you do get a lot of first-time entrepreneurs who really don't have that network, don't have access to people with that type of experience. And so I feel that I live here probably an even greater sense of duty to help others, because a lot of these, really bright young entrepreneurs just wouldn't have natural access to people with the same amount of experience in the industry.
Which leads me to how you ended up in Oklahoma, of all places.
It was through my wife. So I am what a lot of people refer to here as a transplant. I am not a native Okie, but I was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Florida, and then worked most of my career on the East and West Coasts. And when my wife and I were engaged, getting married, she was coming out of her MBA program and had a great career opportunity here that was a once-in-a-lifetime type of opportunity. So that time, Alex and I were two guys working in a coffee shop trying to figure out what we were even doing. So I said, all right, great. Let's go to Oklahoma City. Let's see what it's like. And I had no idea how long that was going to last. But, here we are over a decade later.
kind of crazy because a lot of times when you think about a tech startup, Oklahoma is not a place where you think of.
Yeah, definitely not. And truth be told, I do think it was a more difficult path for us because I made that move, especially early on. We had some competitors who really were able to outraise us and move faster.
Hmm.
Those companies either to some extent just failed and it didn't get traction. There was one that was a pretty sizable success that saw an exit. But it is one of those fun what if games where, if
Hmm.
I had never made that move and we had stayed in New York, who knows how that would have changed the trajectory of the company. Flip side of that is I've met a lot of really amazing, talented coworkers and folks here that probably never would have been part of the Tailwind. And,
Hmm.
the butterfly effects of that could be massive. So, who knows what would have happened? But I think what I can say confidently is you can do it anywhere, right? I mean, even somewhere like Oklahoma that has a much less developed startup ecosystem, you do see significant companies coming out of this environment. I mean, Paycom is probably the biggest example
Hmm.
locally, and they're one of the largest SaaS companies in the world. Um, and their entire staff, I believe, is still based right here in Oklahoma, right? So they haven't
Hmm.
necessarily found that they needed to hire up and start offices in other markets.
Hmm.
So yeah, it can be done for sure, but there are going to be a unique set of challenges and advantages that you'll go through going through that journey wherever you are.
Paycom, I would think of it as also a payroll company, so they consider themselves as a SaaS enabled service company. Then.
Yeah. I mean, definitely today.
Hmm.
I mean, they're certainly one of the competitors in the payroll business, but if you look at a lot of what they market and what they've been building for years now, it's much more of the SaaS offering around
Hmm.
things like, let your employees manage their own time and,
Hmm.
having the app on their phones that they can use to do that. So yeah, I mean, I think not just how they view themselves, but how the market views them now, they
Hmm.
tend to be in the SaaS indices for public companies, and they've had a
Yeah.
really great run. I mean, they just seem to keep growing and growing.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these service industries have evolved so much by having a technology-enabled services that
Yeah,
they almost consider themselves a SaaS product more than a service company, right? Like back in the day, ADP was the payroll company. You never thought of them as a technology company. Now, payroll companies are nothing more than a SaaS company with some sort of service component built into it.
yeah. I think to some extent they had to do that to compete,
Hmm.
and once
Hmm.
that ball starts rolling, then everyone has to do it. And I think some of it was really just strategic for those types of companies. One, a lot better to be valued and viewed as a SaaS company than as a service
Hmm.
based offering. But I think there was also significant room for margin expansion for them in moving towards the SaaS business model as opposed to more of a very usually low margin type of service offering.
So obviously, you in the current iteration of Tailwind had to go multiple pivoting as well, and kind of like you said it with your e-commerce business, you were kind of too early in the e-commerce world, and that you saw some of the struggle because people aren't adapting online shopping as they are today, right? And we've touched on earlier
Yeah,
before the episode started, we talked about Friendster kind of being early to the game, and Facebook kind of approached the market in the right time. So I'm sure that that was kind of the case for you with the Tailwind. So talk to us a little bit about that 12-year journey of building this company. What was kind of the early days of Tailwind, and how has it evolved over the years?
yeah, it's really interesting because the tailwind of today really only came about in the last 5 years of that 12-year
Hmm.
journey. But if I go back to the way beginning, the very first concept that Alex and I worked on was totally different. It was called Bride's View. And the core insight that we were leaning into was that in customer development calls, what we found with brides who were planning their wedding is a lot of people said things like, "Oh, I've done this before, but I know
Hmm.
what I like when I see it." We said, oh, okay, that's interesting. What if we built a site where we had a lot of real wedding photos from real weddings and people could browse them and pick what they like, and then we help them plan their dream wedding based on those insights. And lo and behold, while we're building that, this little site called Pinterest starts blowing
Hmm.
up in
Hmm.
popularity. And our content on the one hand was going viral on Pinterest, which was really great for us. Our, consumer
Hmm.
audience started increasing really. On the other hand, we realized Pinterest was also a direct competitor at that point. And frankly, we thought they were doing it better than we were because they were a generalized use case for planning all sorts of things as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to being niche specific. And so that was the very first big pivot for us. Was we said, okay, yeah, we're not sure that this idea is necessarily going to pan out. And we tried, I don't know, a dozen different ways to monetize that offering, and all of them failed. So we got to the point where we said, okay, we either got to pivot or we got to go back into the corporate world because we don't have endless time. So we decided to try to pivot, and we had built a little bit of tech for ourselves to analyze what content was going viral on Pinterest in particular, and then figure out how we plan out our content strategy based on that. And so we said, okay, well, what if we could take this same concept, generalize it to other markets, and maybe people would be interested in it? So we started testing that out, and that led us down a path with the next major chapter, which was what we now call our legacy product, where we ended up building a SaaS offering for small businesses who were looking to leverage these emerging platforms of Pinterest and Instagram and Tumblr at the time in order to grow their business. And so we had a decent bit of success with that, and we began growing. We especially became known in relation to Pinterest marketing at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that period I would say was like 2013 to 2018, where we were growing, we raised capital, we expanded the team, and so on and so forth. But then come 2018, we saw the writing on the wall that both the world of social was changing in some important ways, specifically moving towards more paid traffic and less free organic traffic distribution. And that was going to impact our customers. But the other challenge we saw for our customers was we had been expanding our toolkit, trying to help them diversify their marketing so that they could be spread across more channels and become more of omni-channel marketers. And it just wasn't really working that well. And a lot of that ultimately came down to they just ran out of time, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
these small businesses did not have large marketing teams. They didn't have enough hours in the week, and they didn't feel they knew other channels. So that almost became our new problem we were trying to solve in about 2018, where we said, okay, how do we lean into that core observation that if small businesses are going to compete as omni-channel marketers with larger businesses, they
Mm-hmm.
have to be able to become far more efficient with the time that they have, which led us down the path of greater automation, which led us to focus on technologies in AI and generative AI. And ultimately, we rebuilt our entire product starting in
Mm-hmm.
2018, 2019, around that time. To become the Tailwind of today. And what
Mm-hmm.
Tailwind is today is we think of it as sort of your marketing team through software. We aim to give small businesses the marketing team that they otherwise couldn't afford. And what that means is Tailwind will help them generate a marketing plan so that they break through the problem of what do I even do? Where do I start? From there, it helps them create the content, both written content and visual content, to execute that plan. And then it also helps solve the distribution challenge of not only organic scheduling and publishing to social networks, but email and now paid ads management as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so it creates sort of this, super efficient marketing rhythm where there's a lot less time needed by the small business owner or entrepreneur, and they
Mm-hmm.
can actually execute on a multi-channel marketing plan, even if they've only got a few hours a week.
From all this data you've collected, obviously you've worked with, from at least what I've read, like millions, 1.5 million clients or something
Yeah,
now.
over that at this
Uh,
point, yeah.
So from all those, what have you seen in terms of like the common trends? Like you said early on the distribution across multiple channel became almost necessary. You realized the organic reach was declining.
Yep.
Some of those things were kind of coming to market, right? And you've worked in those big ad platform companies like Google when it was starting to push out ads in the days, right? So once they start to figure out the monetization model for the platform itself, then they're like, oh, I don't want to give them the distribution organic reach. I got to make money in the process. So, like, what have you learned in terms of what is really working? Obviously, you're building a product to help a customer with creating content and distributing content, but what have you seen to work really well to
Yeah,
help
I
these small
think
businesses?
it might sound basic, and in some extent it is. One of the single biggest things that I find works really well is when a
Mm-hmm.
small business has a real business model, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is they have healthy enough margins where they can actually afford to spend on advertising. They don't necessarily need to feel like they need to get all their traffic for free, all their visibility for free, because they can't afford to pay for it. For most small businesses, that's really what I think of as like, that's the war at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you get to the point where you have a product or service that you've validated enough demand for at a high enough price point where you actually can operate profitably? And
Mm-hmm.
then once you do that, then you should focus on growth, right? And that's where scaling through paid ads and scaling through other channels becomes a lot more relevant. Because frankly, the mistake people make over and over again is they try to scale before they've actually figured out their product or business model. And it just doesn't work, right? Because if you don't have product market fit, you don't have product market fit. Or, like, yeah, you can sell something, but you're selling it at such razor thin margins that there's no hope of you ever scaling that business. And if you find that out later on, it creates a whole host of potential problems where now you've got to reprice. Yeah, you potentially have to reprice for existing customers and so on and so forth. You might need to rethink your entire value chain in terms of production of a product in order to increase your margins. And so I think that's actually the fundamental truth
Mm-hmm.
to everything else you do around marketing. It really off of that moment of getting to the point where you have validated a solid business model.
Yeah, I think it's almost what most people don't even think about, the customer acquisition cost, right? Like if you have figured out, hey, what is my real customer acquisition cost that I can spend a certain amount to acquire a customer because I know how much each customer is going to add over the lifetime of them being with me. Once they have that figured out, right? I mean, fulfillment operation, there's a whole lot of other stuff to be figured out, but if we can at least get that recipe figured out. So I'm curious in terms of, obviously, once you've figured out that you have a good business model, you have people willing to pay what you're worth, you are able to fulfill them within the margins and
Yep.
all of those things. But in terms of kind of the, most people are thinking of immediate conversion when they've paid media or any sort of advertising or even marketing channels. They think like, hey, everything I post should convert into some sort of a sale immediately, which we all know that is not
Yes.
reality, and that's not really possible. But what have you seen to work in terms of the type of mix of content and messaging and offers that people are using on these ads and content that they're producing through your Tailwind?
Yeah, it's hard to answer that because our user base is so broad, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
reality is, for different markets, for different segments, there are going to be different correct answers there, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I will say, the generic trends I don't think are that groundbreaking at this point, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
richer ad content is performing better, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
going to do better off if you're using, carousel ads than single static image ads. Video, if it's good, engaging video ads, is going to perform well on certain metrics in terms of helping to drive awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Honestly, I think the biggest in those early stages is, people try to look for those. Um, they try to look for those trends. Oh, I should do more of this type of content, less of that type of content, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is, can you figure out your selling proposition and your
Mm-hmm.
value hooks that you're going to focus on in your
Mm-hmm.
creative? Because you can always build creative around it, right? Whether you're doing that yourself, whether you're hiring freelancers or agencies to help you with that, or if you're using AI tools increasingly to create that content, you still need to know what those initial value propositions are in
Mm-hmm.
order to figure out what types of content you're going to then expand. And then from there, I think it becomes about experimentation. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might not know exactly what the one value prop is, but maybe you have three or four ideas of what your core value props could be. And then around each of those, you want to build clusters of creative in order to test and try to iterate into the best version of that value proposition. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a use case that I'd say we see more and more people using AI tools like the ones available in Tailwind for, is helping with that really rapid ideation of different takes on an idea, different takes on a value proposition, how to go from, one message or one ad creative to multiple variants of that,
Mm-hmm.
and doing that very, very quickly. Then from there, once you've actually converted that into creative and placements, you can very quickly. And the
Mhm.
ad systems have become pretty efficient at being able to learn with relatively limited budgets in
Mhm.
order to navigate towards where there is performance, right?
Mhm.
And so I think where I would guide people to spend more of their time is figure out what is it that you're really testing in the first place in terms of the message to the market, and then work, don't fall in love with one idea, don't fall in love with one creative treatment or one creative concept or family. Stretch yourself, force yourself to think in terms of this rapid iteration and experimentation approach.
And then obviously, not everybody has a direct conversion into a shopping cart,
Mhm.
sort of a product offering, especially in the SMB world, right? Not
Yes.
everybody's in e-commerce. What are some of the things that you've seen to work in terms of call to actions or next steps that you propose people to do when they're seeing an ad, at least from the Tailwind customer base?
Just to clarify your question, when you say next steps to do,
Like, are they saying like, oh, download a guide or request a call consult, schedule a call?
yeah,
Like, what have you seen in terms of call to actions and next step that these ads are leading people to do?
I think that's highly it's high offering dependent.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when you think about service businesses that might be local in nature, where ultimately at the end of the day, like you've got to get in touch with the client in order to
Mm-hmm.
book them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about things like anything from photographers to real estate agents to interior designers, law firms, whatever it might be. In that
Mm-hmm.
case, it really is about lead generation in terms of getting the contact information and understanding who is expressing interest in the first place in your service. And then a lot of it ultimately comes down to more of the tried and true of get in touch with that person as quickly as humanly possible, right? Don't
Mm-hmm.
lose them. Don't let the leads get stale. Try to get in touch with them. Have a real conversation about their needs. Understand where
Mm-hmm.
they are in prospecting, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about a product that's maybe online, but let's say it's not a physical e-commerce company that's selling goods, but more of an information product or a course, something like that, then it tends to move a lot more towards nurture type of campaigns
Mm-hmm.
because usually the battleground there is around convincing someone that you are enough of an expert that they should actually pull the trigger on buying your offering. And in many, many cases, it's not going to happen just because they saw an ad, right?
Mm-hmm.
You typically, I mean, not only on the paid ad side are you going to need a significant number of impressions before you're able to capture that lead, but from there, you make sure you've got your funnels and your email follow up set up. You have to think of it as a multi-channel type of approach, where
Mm-hmm.
maybe through social you're able to accurately identify your top of funnel audience and get their attention, but more likely than not, you're going to be driving them to conversion through email, in many cases through SMS marketing in some cases, or leveraging search ads in order to ultimately harvest as much of that bottom of funnel intent as possible. So, I mean, those are a couple examples of some of the
Mm-hmm.
business models we see more often. But I do think the right approach and mix of strategies can vary pretty dramatically
Mm-hmm.
based on what fundamental type of offering it is in the first place.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking that is because obviously coming to February, there's a lot of changes happening in terms of email deliverability and free emails and
Yep.
the undeliverable emails, how that's going to affect your sender qualities and things of that nature, right?
Yep.
That's a big concern for most marketers going into the new year, and then also just the fact that, like you described, not everybody coming into the funnel is immediately ready to buy, right? So what sort of call to actions would really make sense to, if email, I mean, we know some stats like, for every dollar spent on email, $42 could be made on the other end,
Yep.
because of the power of email marketing, right? So like, hey, is it the goal to generate that email contact, or is it the goal to book a meeting? And if you had some sort of a stat or trends or anything that you may have gathered from having worked with millions of customers.
Yeah, I think what's kind of interesting about those stats is when you look at email and you look at, say, paid search in particular, there's still such a bias in attribution that leads to these expectations of just massive ROI that
Mm-hmm.
often tell a very small portion of the picture, right? So with email, sure, you see those stats like the $42 per dollar spent floated around. The question is, how many dollars did you have to spend to actually get the lead to that point where you can convert them in the
Mm-hmm.
first place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I mean, of course, you should do the high margin, high return thing, right? So, like, I've
Mm-hmm.
got a friend who's been running an e-commerce business for a long time, and he likes to say that email has been his print money button, right? Where
Hmm.
literally he has
Send an
proven
email.
to himself over time, the more emails he sends, the more sales he
Hmm.
generates, and
Hmm.
he can track it to the point of, I hit send, this many dollars come in. Um, Even with like a relatively basic email strategy that isn't, anything that's super innovative, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so, I mean, of course, once you've got that audience, once you have those leads, once you have people who have already purchased from you as previous customers that you can re-engage, of course, right? Like, go maximize that LTV and make
Hmm.
sure that you've got the rhythms in place to generate those really high dollar ROIs. I think honestly, where a lot of small businesses are is like they're trying to build up that audience in the first place, right?
Hmm.
And that's where I'd say the scariest part of the journey usually happens, because what I've observed is a lot of small business owners think more like consumers than like business
Hmm.
owners, right? And what I mean by that is, consumers, we always want a deal, we always want something cheaper, we always like free stuff, right? And so we start businesses and we think, okay, yeah, let me try to get some of that free traffic, that free exposure, free this. And eventually, after you've done it long enough, you realize, one, free isn't free. It's going to cost you
Hmm.
in time, it's going to cost you in energy and other ways. But even if you get that free organic traction, there's almost always a plateau there.
Hmm.
And so you should get it, grab it, as much of it as you can. Um, but very often you cannot infinitely scale a business on the back of organic traffic, right? And so then all of a sudden, this entrepreneur, this business owner, hits the point where they say, okay, you know what, I think I've got to try paid. And as you said before, Sam, you're not going to be in the case in most instances where you just put money in and you're immediately generating sales. I mean, for
Hmm.
one, most businesses have like no audience data at that point in time. And so you're building all of your audience and targeting data from the ground up. And that's going to take time and energy and dollars spent to
Hmm.
get through there. But then there's also just the natural delay in working someone through the marketing funnel, where now you have to think about, okay, how much can I afford to spend over a 3 to 6 month period before potentially beginning to see significant gains, knowing I could actually fail and lose all of that money, right?
Hmm.
And it still needs to be affordable to me. And I think that's where people begin to have sort of like the sirens going off of fear is,
Hmm.
oh no, right? Like, this isn't $1,000 a month of experimental budget. It's $6,000 of experimental budget over
Hmm.
6 months. And if they don't think of it that way, unfortunately, then they might dip their toe in the water, determine it's not working fast enough, and then stop. Right. And
Hmm.
maybe they were getting to the point where they would start seeing results, but they pulled the plug too soon. Yeah, I think that's one of the major just psychological barriers for most small businesses of figuring out how to even get their marketing engine going in the first place.
Yeah, and I think like you described, I think a lot of times, you have to think of marketing as an investment, not as an expense. Once you start to see it as a cost center, you don't invest, and that's usually the first thing that they cut
Yep.
when it comes to. And then also, I think the overall, like I think we touched on earlier, but that lifetime value. So if you know your lifetime value for customers, certain right, you have to be investing a percentage of what it means to acquire that customer, right? Funding what is, because a lot of times, I talked to that, their average order value is like 60,000, but they think $150 a lead is expensive.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, try going and hiring salespeople to go sell to that company. You will see how expensive it is to sell. Right. So knowing what the actual lifetime value and investing accordingly, right, proportionate to the actual value you're going to gain back. It's almost like, we all know that in stock market, you're probably averaging about 10% if you're lucky on an average year, but you the marketing world, oh, I'm supposed to be 10x the value of what you invest. So I think that's kind of an unreasonable expectation when it comes to marketing, if you ask.
Yeah, and that's where ed becomes so important, right? And for us, it becomes a big part of our job, and what we do is we've got to provide those educational resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, ultimately, it's not for us. It is to an extent, but the reason for it is because we want our customers to be able to succeed, right?
Hmm.
And without that perspective, without really understanding what they're trying to accomplish in investing
Hmm.
in marketing, there's a very good chance that they end up pulling the plug on things that they should give a little bit more time and energy to, or vice versa. They just start doing something and they keep doing it for years, even if it's not having a significant impact for them, because
Hmm.
they get comfortable with it, right? Like it
Hmm.
becomes the thing that I know how to do, and I'm not necessarily holding it to any performance standard. So I'm just going to keep doing it out of momentum and because it gives me a sense of fulfillment or a sense of activity. So there's kind of risks on both sides of that
Yeah.
equation, but education becomes really, really critical.
Yeah, and I think marketing, a lot of people consider marketing as a risky
Yeah.
endeavor, but I think it's not a risk; it's a calculated risk, right? Like you know exactly what you're trying to do, and you have to make a hypothesis of what you're trying to accomplish. You test your hypothesis, and then you iterate as you need to change. And I think a lot of times, people give up on a specific channel or a marketing tactic
Yep.
because they've tried it and failed because their experiment wasn't the right one. Then they just write that whole thing off and say, "Well, paid search doesn't work because it's costly and never works." But they just never pause and think like, well, we were bidding on the wrong terms. We, whatever those things are, right? Like you do need to analyze your what you tried. Sometimes it could be what you've done is what's wrong.
And maybe it wasn't actually costly, right? It might
Mm-hmm.
sound costly when you're in that consumer mentality as opposed to the business owner mentality. And when
Mm-hmm.
people aren't trained to think in terms of ROI, they might say, okay, yeah, it cost me $25 to generate a lead, and not all of those people are buying from me. So that feels really expensive. Where when you
Mm-hmm.
look at it from a different lens, it's okay, $25 to acquire a lead, 10% of which convert. And
Mm-hmm.
let's say my AOV is $2,000, right? Oh, okay,
Mm-hmm.
now it's costing me $250 to print $2,000. If they looked at it
Mm-hmm.
that way, they'd say this is a complete bargain, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to do this all day, every day. And that's actually, it's something that in our own training early on in the life of the company, and coming back to being based in Oklahoma, where there's not as developed of an ecosystem, we have to teach people the SaaS business model so that they
Mm-hmm.
can understand how our own business functions as they're joining the team. And
Mm-hmm.
that was the analogy that I used was, imagine you have this magical ATM,
Mm-hmm.
and instead of putting in a dollar and getting a dollar back, you put in a certain amount and you get a perpetual stream of money
Mm-hmm.
back from the machine over time. Right now, start thinking about the metrics there of how much you're willing to put in based on how much you get out, and then introducing them to the various key metrics in the SaaS business model through that
Mm-hmm.
analogy. And that I found created a much greater understanding of how our business functioned, and it enabled people who had never worked in SaaS before to
Mm-hmm.
very, very quickly. I mean, of course, they're like brilliant, super smart people anyway, but to very, very quickly come to grasp what it is we're doing here and what it takes for our business to function.
Obviously, we can talk about marketing for quite some time, but I'm just curious to kind of pivot a little bit to learn a little bit about some of the other entrepreneurial lessons you've learned. Obviously, having to pivot, changing with the time,
Yep.
and even reworking the business offering product. There's a lot of stuff that you had to do to build a company, and even just the lessons learned of having to build a company in an in tech hub, right? Like Oklahoma, that's also brought its own lessons from having to build a company there. What other lessons have you learned in building a company? I saw that well over 100 employees works there. You've been in business for 12 years, building a SaaS company, and even thought when you talked about AI that you were just a AI craze that just came out of the Chat GPT revolution. But it seems that you were already working on it in 2018 with AI products. So there's definitely been a lot of things that you were working on. So what are other lessons you've learned in the process of building this business?
Yeah, I think in relation to pivoting, I think there's a really strong personal parallel to that. And I like to think of it as staying clueless, right?
Mm-hmm.
So no matter how much experience you have, no matter what point you get to in your career, how much success you've had, you need to continuously view yourself as a work in progress and
Mm-hmm.
something that is incomplete and imperfect. And if I reflect back on my own life, my own career, the periods where I had the greatest personal growth and development were periods where I had the humility to realize my faults, realize my blind spots, and not assume that because I did something a certain way in the past, I needed to continue doing it that way in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's really, really critical. And conversely, the periods where I probably experienced the least personal growth were the periods where I became most arrogant, most cocky, and thought I had it all figured out, and it was
Mm-hmm.
just a matter of execution, right? Personally, I've observed I tend to go through cycles there, where you
Mm-hmm.
go to one end of the spectrum, get humbled, come back to the other end of the spectrum, maybe be a little bit too humble, and realize I need to lean in a bit more. But that's what's kept the journey fun, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm.
For someone like me who gets bored from working on the same challenge pretty quickly,
Mm-hmm.
it keeps you growing. It keeps you focusing on new challenges over time. And as an entrepreneur, if you grow, that creates growth opportunity for the people around you, for your
Mm-hmm.
team, and that keeps it fun for them as well. So yeah, I think that's one major theme comes to
Mm-hmm.
mind for me. I think a second one, and it's almost a cliche at this point, but the idea of skating to where the puck is going.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a certain balance to that where if I reflect on our own journey of rebuilding the product over the last 5 years, the reality is we probably started skating to where the puck was going a little bit too soon. On the flip side, we wouldn't be where we are today with the technology that we had, that we've developed, that we acquired in some cases, and then expanded upon. We wouldn't be where we are if we hadn't started that journey when we did. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I think there's something to that, to let the numbers tell you when you are too early, so
Mm-hmm.
that you don't overinvest in a certain direction, but also don't wait till it's too late, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the flip side is, if we had waited 2 more years to start that transition, we probably wouldn't have made it. And we wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
have been in position in this last year when all of a sudden AI adoption started growing really rapidly due to forces beyond our control and really
Mm-hmm.
beyond our influence. We wouldn't have been in the right place at the right time when that happened. So that's a that I think comes to mind. Pivoting in and of itself is not necessarily enough, because I think along the way we had a bunch of micro pivots, and to an extent, when you're building a software product, every decision you make about where to take the product next is a pivot. It's just
Mm-hmm.
either a bigger or a smaller pivot. Um, but a lot of the things that didn't work so well for us over time were when we were just kind of doing things that already existed, or that someone else did pretty well. And we thought, oh, we should add that too. We should,
Mm-hmm.
expand in that direction as well. And then we put the time and effort in, we get it to market, and we find, oh, well, people aren't using it that much, because guess what? Someone else was already doing it pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And, now we're stuck in a game of trying to catch up, right? And so that's a risk, I think, in entrepreneurship to be wary of, is if you watch what other people are doing and you try to copycat, or you try to mimic what they're doing, in a lot of cases, that's just not going to go well, because you're
Mm-hmm.
probably at that point too late already.
Yeah. And if you're going to innovate, right, like have authentic and new ideas that you bring as opposed to just copying
Yeah.
somebody else's idea. And like you talked about it, sometimes, you can't time the market, but clearly, sometimes if you're going to, the puck is going before, getting there before you're there, you can probably make a lot of strategic moves that can set the trajectory for the
Yeah.
business too.
And it's similar to what you said about marketing, right? It's a calculated risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Entrepreneurship is a series of calculated risks that you take over time. You just want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure, one, that you're doing it and you are taking those risks, and two, that they're truly calculated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's also easy to fall in love with your idea, and bet the house on something that isn't necessarily a calculated risk. And next thing you know, there's no house anymore, right?
Exactly. Well, obviously, you're a busy man running a company, have a family, all these things, and you're a mentor, all those things. Where do you find time? Is there some sort of productivity hack that you have that helped you kind of stay on track?
The biggest one, the single biggest one that has been most important for me to learn over time, is simply delegation, right?
Mm-hmm.
My biggest productivity hack has been investing in the growth of others and truly empowering other leaders within our company, to the point where you get it to the point where you say, you know what, this business can operate without me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can get away, I can go on vacation, I can take time to invest in a cause that's important to me, that I want to be able to support, because the business is running really smoothly. You've now got developed leaders in multiple areas. uh, that was the thing I was probably worst at early
Mm-hmm.
on in being an entrepreneur. And part of it was just I wanted to do the things. I wanted to learn how to do certain things. I wanted the experience of, oh, this sounds interesting. That sounds interesting. I want to be on. And then you get into your ways of how you want them done, and someone else isn't going to do them exactly the same way, or you assume that your way is better. And I definitely fell into that trap over time. Um, and these are pretty common themes that you hear about in
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneurship. The sooner you begin to learn to trust others and hold them accountable, and then get them to the point where they hold themselves accountable, is the sooner that you begin to grow as a leader and that your organization then becomes poised for growth as well.
And obviously, we talked about the productivity hack. Are there anything that you're doing in terms of, like you mentioned, you grew when you were more humble and you were willing to recognize your faults and things like that? What are other some ways of your learning? Is there like books that you read or a podcast that you listen to that have helped you?
It's kind of interesting. I say yes as a gut
Mm-hmm.
reaction. The reality is I probably consume fewer books and fewer podcasts now than I used to. I think there was a period in my life where I did a lot of that, and then I ultimately determined that I was learning the most by doing. And then
Mm-hmm.
I think the next step after that for me was learning through a peer group. So in my
Mm-hmm.
case, I joined a peer group of other small business CEOs. It sounded like a huge time commitment. It was one full day every single month,
Mm-hmm.
plus like a multi-day retreat once a year.
Mm-hmm.
But that was absolutely pivotal in my own learning because it's one thing when you learn by doing in the trajectory of your own company, and
Mm-hmm.
in 3 years you get 3 years worth of learning, right? You then sit around a table with 12 other people, let's say, who have been building businesses. I was usually the youngest one in the room, right? So
Mm-hmm.
building businesses for decades, and they have decades of learning in front of them. And when you run into an issue that you're not sure how to address or how to solve, you can now suddenly tap into these decades of learning from other people. And
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to agree with everyone's perspective and do what they say, but you're going to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably that next big hack for me, was getting into that type of a group with people who really cared about each other's growth, who were willing to say the hard thing
Mm-hmm.
and challenge each other and be challenged. That was absolutely invaluable to me.
And are you using anything like eMyth or EOS or a scaling up or anything like that to run the organization too?
We're not using any of those formal systems. We kind of have our own processes that we've developed and evolved over time, often informed by those things. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we'll across the team, and
Mm-hmm.
we find different examples of frameworks that are interesting over time that we might want to consider. We've experimented with some things, thrown some out, kept some. But we haven't necessarily said, okay, yeah, we're just going to use this one particular system
Mm-hmm.
to operate. Um, I think a lot of that often has felt like the time it would take to slow down to implement a system like that is too costly to us, and we're better off
Mm-hmm.
continuing to stay focused on where we're going and executing, and trying to take the principles from it into what we're doing.
That makes sense. Knowing what you know today, what advice would you give the younger Danny?
Oh gosh, oh, that's a really good question. I'm not someone who typically spends a lot of time on regret, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
believe in learning from experiences, but not living in the past and not getting there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard for me to answer that because I view any mistake I would have made, any challenge I've had, as just part of the learning journey over time, right? I think if anything, it would probably be pushing myself in the direction of delegating more sooner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And seeing where that goes. That's probably number one. Um, and if I had to think about number two, it's probably when you do go through those pivots and those moments of change, always coming back to the fundamentals, right? Always
Mm-hmm.
coming back to the basis of, are we super clear on who we're trying to serve with this? Are we super clear on what problem we're solving for them? Are they validating that problem? Is it a valuable problem? Going back to those early stages of invalidation of an idea every single time
Mm-hmm.
religiously, because probably some of the biggest missteps we had of where we over invested in something was where we short circuited that process. And then you get further down the road, you've spent a lot of time and energy on something, but you never, tackled the of it. And then you end up with a project that doesn't work.
That's a great insight to kind of end our conversation. Danny, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing some of your life lesson and wisdom with our audience.
Thanks, Sam. Really enjoyed chatting with you.
If you enjoyed this video, please share it. To make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe.